The first time I saw the dusty blue cottage, I thought it was a sanctuary. My name is Reese Victoria, and this house was my inheritance, my one and only escape from a life of being the responsible, quiet one. It was my freedom. But my grandmother, the only person who ever truly saw me, left me more than just a house. Tucked inside her old desk, I found a final terrifying letter. It was a warning. She knew they would come for it. She knew they wouldn't be kind. I was ready to grieve. I wasn't ready for a war. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The first time I saw the house, I didn't just smell old wood and roses. I smelled freedom. It was a small, dusty blue cottage on the edge of Silver Creek, Colorado. The kind of place with a wide front porch and climbing vines that hadn't been tamed in at least a decade. It was the only thing my Grandma June ever left me. It was also, as I'd soon find out, the bait in a trap my own family had been setting for years. I'd arrived only an hour before my beat-up sedan packed with everything I owned, which wasn't much. I'd left a soul-crushing tech support job in Denver, a tiny apartment that smelled like my neighbor's stale cooking, and a life where I felt like a ghost. I was Reese Victoria, 26 years old, the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who just handled things. Which really meant I was the one who got overshadowed by my older, louder, and infinitely more demanding sister Amber. My arrival in Silver Creek was bittersweet. I was hollowed out with grief. Grandma June was gone, and she was the only person in my entire family who ever really saw me. The only one who didn't look at me and see a placeholder, a babysitter, or a bank. The reading of the will had been tense. It was held over a staticky video call, my parents and sister glaring at me from their little box on the screen, their faces a mask of strained politeness. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a dry man with a kind voice, read the final crucial passage. To my granddaughter, Reese Victoria, I leave my home at 312 Willow Way free and clear, and my business, the Silver Sparrow Bakery. She is the only one who ever watered a plant without being asked, and the only one who understood that this bakery isn't a piggy bank, it's a heart. I saw my sister's face go pale on the screen, her mouth opening before my father abruptly ended the call. The house was mine. The bakery was mine. It was terrifying and it was glorious. I hadn't even unpacked my suitcase. I was just standing in the dusty living room, letting the silence settle around me when my phone buzzed, vibrating violently against the hardwood floor. My mother, Meredith. I almost didn't answer. I should have listened to that instinct. What did you do, Reese? Her voice wasn't sad. It was sharp, like shattered glass. How did you poison her against us? You sat there acting all quiet and helpful and you poisoned her. I tried to speak, but she rolled right over me. You know Amber needed that house. She has kids. What are you going to do in a house that big all by yourself? It's just cruel, Reese. You're being incredibly selfish. I mumbled something about Grandma's wishes, but she cut me off. We are your family. You don't get to just take what's ours. Your father and I will discuss this. This is not the end of it. She hung up. Ours, not mine. The word echoed in the empty room. My hands were shaking. I needed to move, to do something other than stare at the wall where her voice had just violated my newfound peace. I started exploring the cottage, running my hands along the dusty surfaces. It smelled like her cinnamon old books, and something floral like the rose bushes outside. In the small study, sitting like a silent king in the corner, was her old roll-top desk. I hadn't sat there since I was a kid. I pulled up the heavy wooden cover. It groaned in protest. Inside were the expected things: old checkbooks, dried-up pens, a scattering of paper clips. But as I ran my fingers along the back, I felt a small wooden tab, a loose piece of the divider. I'd never known it was there. My heart thudded. I wiggled it, and a thin slat of wood popped free. Behind it there was only one thing: a thick cream-colored envelope with my name, Reese, written in her elegant looping script. I tore it open. The letter was short. My dearest Reese, by the time you read this, I'm gone. Be careful. Your mother and sisters see this house as a prize they are owed. They will come for it. They will not be kind. That's why it's all in your name. You are stronger than they've ever let you be. Don't let them break you. P.S. The big mixer is tricky. You have to kick the base. June. A single tear dripped onto the paper, blurring the ink. I felt this bizarre, painful mix of emotions. I was validated. She knew. She'd seen their greed all along. But I was also terrified. A cold spike of dread, colder than the Colorado air, shot right through my chest. She had left me a gift, but she had also left me a warning. I stood there clutching the letter, the paper crinkling in my fist. The silence of the house felt protective, until it wasn't. From outside, a sound shattered the quiet, a loud, obnoxious, and sickeningly familiar honk. It was the rhythm she always used, short, long. I crept to the front window, pushing aside the lace curtain. A massive, dented silver SUV was pulling into the driveway, scattering the gravel. Two small, screaming faces were pressed against the back windows. Amber. She wasn't supposed to be here for another week. They weren't supposed to be here at all. But they were here. They were already here. I didn't even have time to lock the deadbolt. The front door burst open, slamming against the wall so hard a small framed picture of a finch fell from its hook. Amber stormed in, not like a guest, but like a new owner who was displeased with the service. She was a whirlwind of cheap perfume, frantic energy, and unspoken demands. Her husband Chad ambled in behind her, carrying a duffel bag, and wearing that familiar vacant expression he always had. He was a man who seemed to have been born tired. "Jesus, Reese, this place is filthy," Amber announced, dropping her purse on Grandma's antique cherry wood table. "And the smell. It's like a funeral home." Her two kids, hyper from the long drive, shot past her and started jumping on the floral sofa, sticky hands leaving dark prints. "Don't just stand there, Reese, say hi to your nephews." I was still frozen by the window, my grandmother's letter, a crumpled, sweaty ball inside my pocket. "Amber, what are you doing here? You said next week." She waved a dismissive hand already in the kitchen, yanking open the fridge. "Yeah, well, the landlord on our old place was being a psycho about the deposit, so we just bounced. Whatever." She pulled out the pitcher of lemonade I'd made an hour ago and poured herself a glass. "God, you even make lemonade like an old lady. Way too sweet." She came back into the living room, sipping, and finally looked at me, a look of profound inconvenience on her face. "So here's how this is gonna work. It's a good thing this place is bigger than I remembered. Chad and I and the kids will take the whole upstairs. The master has that little adjoining bathroom, right? So the kids can use that. You can have the master bedroom downstairs since it's got its own door, and you'll be up at like 4 in the morning for that bakery thing anyway. It just makes sense. We've already enrolled the kids in the local elementary school. The registration was a nightmare, by the way. You owe me for that." I just stared at her. My brain was short-circuiting. Enrolled the kids. "Amber, what are you talking about? You can't just—" "Oh yeah," she continued, cutting me off as she inspected a floor lamp. "And the bakery. Mom and I already talked it through. It's perfect. You can handle all the, baking and the day-to-day stuff. All the profits will just go into a new family account. I'll manage the account, to pay the mortgage and the bills and—" I found my voice, though it came out thin and reedy. "There is no mortgage. Grandma paid it off." Amber didn't even blink. "Right. Well, for the utilities then, and the property taxes, and the kids' school funds. It's the only fair way, Reese. Family helps family. You get to live your little baker fantasy rent-free, and we get the financial support we deserve. Chad's back is playing up again. He can't be expected to work right now." My hand tightened around the letter in my pocket. The paper felt like a shield. They will come for it. They will not be kind. No. It was just one word, so quiet I wasn't sure I'd said it. Amber was still talking. "And this wallpaper has to go. It's—" "No." I said it louder. My voice cracked, but it was firm. Amber stopped, her head tilting. What did you say? I pulled the letter out of my pocket. I didn't open it. I just held it. I said no, that's not happening. You're not moving in. This isn't a family account. Grandma left the house and the bakery to me. Just me. It's mine. The breezy, entitled mask on Amber's face didn't just vanish. It evaporated. Her expression twisted into something I hadn't seen since she was a teenager who'd been told she couldn't have the car. It was pure, unfiltered rage. You selfish little bitch! The word hung in the air, thick and ugly. Did you really think we'd let you keep this house, you, after everything I've been through? After all my sacrifices? Mom was right about you. She said you'd turn into this. She said you were a snake. Chad, who had been silently observing, suddenly moved. He was bigger than me, and he used that size to corner me against the hallway wall. He leaned, in his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was somehow more threatening than Amber's shriek. Your sister deserves this, Reese. She's had a hard time. Don't make this hard. His eyes were dead. I felt a cold terror that had nothing to do with my grandmother's warning. This was new. Get out, I said, my voice trembling. Get out of my house. For a second, no one moved. Then Amber let out a sound of pure disgust. Fine, keep your dusty, stupid house, but don't come crying to us when you're all alone and you've failed just like you fail at everything. She grabbed her purse, barked at her kids, and stormed out, Chad right behind her. The front door slammed, and this time the little Finch picture fell to the floor, the glass shattering. I slid down the wall, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break a rib. I locked the deadbolt. I locked the chain. I sat there on the floor for God knows how long, just breathing. I did it. I said no. The small victory felt sour. I knew this wasn't the end. And just as that thought crossed my mind, my phone, which was still on the floor, buzzed. A text message. It was from my father, David. Your mother is hysterical, crying. I've never seen her this upset. I've booked a flight for both of us. We are coming to sort out this mess you've made. We're having a family meeting tomorrow night. And you will listen. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of suspended dread. Every car that passed on the street made my stomach clench. I didn't sleep. I just drank black coffee and reread my grandmother's letter until the creases were soft as cloth. They arrived at 7 p.m., just as the sun was bleeding out behind the mountains, casting long, cold shadows across the porch. It was a sterile white rental car. They didn't knock. My father David used his own key, a key I never knew he had. They walked in not like parents visiting a grieving daughter, but like auditors arriving for an inspection. My mother Meredith marched straight to the kitchen table and sat down, placing her designer handbag on it with a sharp thwack. My father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed his face, a mask of disappointment that I knew well. It was the face he used right before a lecture, the one that said, "You have failed me again." Reese, my mother began, her voice dripping with a false syrupy concern. Honey, we need to talk. Your father and we're just so worried about you. I stayed standing, my back against the wall. I'm fine, Mom. I'm just tired. No, sweetie, you're not fine, she said, shaking her head, her perfectly highlighted hair not moving an inch. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. You can't possibly understand the responsibility you've taken on. Running a business all alone, it's just not feasible. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with practiced sympathy. And your sister, Reese, she has children. What would the community think? What would all of June's friends think, knowing you have 3 empty bedrooms here, all this space, while your little nieces are sleeping on top of each other in that cramped apartment? It's a bad look, Reese. It's not what family does. I opened my mouth to argue, to say that Amber's living situation was a choice she'd made, but my father cut me off. His voice, unlike my mother's, was cold and flat. No emotion, just authority. This independence is a fantasy, Reese, he stated as if reading a verdict. You've always been fragile. You get overwhelmed. We know what's best for this family. And what's best is that you are not in charge of these assets. Assets. I repeated the word tasting like poison. You mean my home? It's a family asset, he snapped. And here is how this is going to be resolved. We have already had a lawyer draft the paperwork. You will sign this house and the bakery over to a family trust. Your sister Amber will be the trustee, and she and her family will move in. You will be accommodated. Accommodated. You will be a salaried employee at the bakery, he said, the ultimate generous concession. We'll pay you a fair wage. You can keep the downstairs bedroom. It's the only logical solution. It protects everyone, especially you. The air left my lungs. A salaried employee. In my own bakery. A tenant in my own home. I was shaking, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was a white-hot, unfamiliar rage. No! My father's eyebrows shot up. I had never told him no. I said no, I repeated louder. Grandma left it to me. She knew exactly what she was doing. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out the letter, holding it up. She even warned me. She warned me you would do this. My father didn't look angry. He looked amused. He let out a short, sharp scoff. That you're basing this on the ramblings of a sick old woman. She wasn't sick, I whispered, my voice breaking. She was just old. She knew you. She was being manipulated, Reese. He said, his voice dropping, taking on a tone of paternal pity that made my skin crawl. And she was mentally incompetent. In fact, we've already spoken to her lawyer. We are contesting the will on those grounds. That was it. That was the blow that took all the air, all the fight out of me. It wasn't just greed. They weren't just trying to take my house. They were willing to stand up in a court of law and destroy the memory of the one person who had ever believed in me. They would paint her as senile, crazy, incompetent, all to get their hands on this house. My grief, which had been a dull ache, suddenly became a searing physical pain. This was the real betrayal. Get out, I said. It was so quiet, I wasn't sure I'd spoken. My mother started, Reese, don't be dramatic. I said, get out. I looked up, and I must have looked truly unhinged, because for the first time my mother's mask of concern faltered. She looked afraid. Now, Reese, you listen to your father. My dad started taking a step toward me. That's when I screamed. It was a sound I didn't know I was capable of, a raw, primal howl that came from the deepest part of me. Get out! Get out of my house! They recoiled. My mother actually grabbed her purse, her eyes wide. My father's face was white with shock and fury. You will regret this, young lady, he seethed. You will be hearing from our lawyer. Get out! I screamed again, pointing at the door. They left. They scrambled out, my father practically pushing my mother ahead of him. The door slammed shut, and the silence that fell was absolute terrifying. I slid to the floor, my whole body vibrating. Hours passed. The sun went down. The house was dark, but I didn't turn on the lights. I couldn't breathe in here. The walls felt like they were closing in, tainted by their threats. I needed air. I needed the bakery, the one place that was safe, the one place that was just mine and Grandma's. I grabbed my keys and ran out to my car, desperate to be somewhere I could think. I pulled up behind the bakery. The alley was dark, the moon just a sliver. I fumbled with the key to the back door. It clicked open. The air that hit me was wrong. It wasn't the warm yeast and sugar smell I remembered. It was cold. And I heard a sound. A drip, drip, drip. I flipped the light switch, and my world fell apart. Someone had left all the freezers wide open. Sacks of flour and sugar were torn, their contents mixing with a growing pool of water on the floor. And the main water pipe under the industrial sink, it wasn't leaking. It had been deliberately, methodically loosened. The kitchen was flooding. For a long second, I just stood there, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The floor was a sickening soup of melted butter, cracked eggs, and soggy flour. The cold air pouring from the open freezers was thick with the smell of spoiled milk and thawing fruit. Thousands of dollars of inventory, my inventory was utterly ruined. I waded through the mess, my shoes sucking at the flooded tile. The pipe was an easy fix. A wrench could tighten it. But the freezers, they had been open for hours. This was calculated. This was meant to break me. And then I saw it. The heart of the bakery. Grandma June's ancient massive Hobart mixer, the one she'd warned me about. It was the only thing that could handle the bakery's large batches. I went to flip the power switch just to see, but my hand stopped. A thick rubber belt, the main drive belt, was lying on the floor beside it, severed clean through. Someone had taken a knife and deliberately carefully killed it. This wasn't just vandalism, this was sabotage. My first call was to the police. Sheriff Brody showed up 20 minutes later, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. He was a gruff man who had known my grandmother for 30 years. He'd been the one to find her when she passed. He listened patiently, his hands on his hips. "I hear you, Reese," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is a damn shame. A real mess." "It was my family," I said, my voice flat dead. "My parents. My sister. They were here. They threatened me." He sighed, kicking at a soggy sack of sugar. "Here's the problem, son. I see the damage. But I don't see a crime. Not one I can pin on anyone." "What about breaking and entering?" "Back door was locked when I got here," he said. "You locked it when you left." I nodded, confused. "And you unlocked it when you got here." I nodded again. "No sign of forced entry, no broken window locks not picked. As far as the law is concerned, whoever did this, they had a key." My blood ran cold. Of course. They had a key to the house. Why wouldn't they have one to the bakery? This is a family dispute, Reese," he said, and I could hear the pity in his voice, which was worse than anger. "My hands are tied. You get this cleaned up and maybe install some cameras." He left, and I was alone again, surrounded by the ruins. I slid down the wall, my back against the cold stainless steel, and just sat in the middle of the flood. He was right. It was a family dispute, and they were winning. I sat there until my jeans were soaked through. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually I heard a truck pull into the alley. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A man got out, tall and wearing a worn canvas jacket. He knocked on the open door frame. "Heard you had a plumbing problem." I looked up. It was Elias Thorne. I didn't know him well, just that he was the local handyman, a quiet guy in his late 20s who'd always been kind to June. He'd fixed her porch swing last summer. He stepped inside his boots, stopping at the edge of the water. He took in the scene, the flooded floor, the open freezers, the ruined supplies. Then his eyes landed on the mixer and the cut belt lying beside it. He looked at me, his gaze sharp and clear. "That's not plumbing," he said, his voice quiet. "That's malice." I don't know why, but hearing him say it, hearing someone else validate what I knew, it was like a dam broke. I didn't cry. I got angry. I stood up, wiping my wet hands on my jeans. "Can you fix it?" Elias ran a hand through his dark hair. "The pipe, yeah. That's easy. The mixer. This part," he said, picking up the severed belt, "is obsolete. They don't make 'em. I'll have to machine a new one from scratch. It'll take a day or two. At least." "Do it," I said. This was a test. I knew it. If the bakery stayed closed, my family would win. They would point and say, "See, she can't handle it." They would use this act of destruction as proof of my incompetence. They were banking on me quitting. I went to the small flooded office in the back. I sat down at the desk, pulled out my laptop, and logged into my bank account. I had just over $9,000. It was every cent I had saved from that soul-crushing tech job, my entire life. I clicked transfer. I moved it all into the bakery's business account. I was not going to fail. Elias worked all night. He fixed the pipe and I worked beside him, mopping, scrubbing, hauling garbage bags full of spoiled inventory to the dumpster. By dawn, the floor was clean, and Elias was gone, taking the broken parts with him. I spent the next 2 days in a blur. I ordered new inventory. I cleaned every surface. I prepped dough in small, agonizing batches with a tiny countertop mixer. I was exhausted. I was broke. But I was furious. The fear was finally burning off, replaced by a cold, hard rage that felt like steel in my spine. On the third morning, Elias arrived with the new gleaming black belt. We installed it, and when I flipped the switch, the old Hobart roared to life with a beautiful grinding whump. It was the best sound I had ever heard. I was ready. I was going to reopen. I grabbed my phone planning to post an announcement on the town's community Facebook page. But when I opened the app, I froze. The first post in the feed wasn't mine. It was from Amber. It was a picture of her two kids staring mournfully at the camera, their faces expertly smudged with what looked like dirt. The caption stabbed me right in the chest. So heartbroken. My sister has kicked us out and is now selling our grandmother's beloved bakery to a corporate chain. She's destroying our family legacy all for money. We just wanted to be a family. Please. Someone tell her not to let greed win. The post was an hour old. It already had over 200 sad reacts and 80 comments from locals, all expressing their support for my poor victimized sister. I flipped the open sign, the little bell on the door tinkling cheerfully, a sound that felt like a mockery. I had spent the last of my money, worked for 3 days straight without sleep, and fought back against their sabotage. I felt raw, but I was proud. I was here. I was open. That pride lasted about 10 minutes. The morning rush, the one I'd seen Grandma June handle 100 times, never came. People I had known my whole life, people who had kissed my cheeks as a child, walked by on the other side of the street, pointedly looking away. A few, like Mr. Henderson from the hardware store, just glared through the glass, his face a mask of profound disappointment before hurrying on. I was a social pariah. My sister's lies, posted on the town's digital front porch, had done their work. I was no longer Reese June's quiet granddaughter. I was the greedy, corporate-selling monster who kicked her nephews out on the street. At 11, the bell finally rang. My heart leaped, but it was Mrs. Gable, her silver hair pulled into its usual tight bun. She was one of June's oldest friends, a woman who had taught me to knit. She didn't look at the pastries. She just marched right up to the counter. "Reese," she said, her voice tight with disapproval. "I've known you since you were in diapers. What your sister is saying, about you selling this place to a chain, after everything your grandmother put into it, tell me it isn't true." "It's not true, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice desperate. "I would never. Amber is... she's lying. I'm reopening just like Grandma did." Mrs. Gable just stared at me, her eyes searching my face. I could see the doubt. I was one person telling a quiet truth. Amber was a grieving mother posting pictures of her sad children. I had no chance. "Well," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself, "some of us at the church are concerned. Your mother called Pastor Miles, said that you'd taken money from them, stolen their inheritance. I just don't know what to think." She left without buying anything. The bell tinkled again, signaling her departure. The silence she left behind was deafening. My parents. Of course. It wasn't just Amber. It was a coordinated attack. They were poisoning the well from every direction. Social media, the church, the community leaders. I was completely, utterly isolated. The day dragged on. Not a single customer. The fresh croissants went stale. The bread I'd baked at 4 a.m. grew cold. The financial squeeze was no longer a threat. It was a reality. I had maybe $200 left in the world. I couldn't make payroll for the one part-time employee I'd hired. I couldn't pay the electricity bill that was coming due. I was going to lose the house and the bakery, not in a month, but in a week. My family wouldn't even have to fight me in court. They would just wait for the bank to foreclose, then swoop in and buy it all for pennies. They would win by default. That night, I didn't go home. I just sat in the dark, empty bakery, the chairs stacked on the tables, the display case empty and cold. I was broke. I was alone. My reputation was ruined. They had taken everything from me without ever laying a hand on me. They had won. I put my head down on the cold steel prep table, and for the first time since this all began, I completely broke down. I sobbed, a racking, ugly, hopeless sound that was swallowed by the darkness. I was grieving my grandmother, my family, my stolen future, and my own pathetic weakness. My hand trembling knocked against a stack of boxes I'd piled in the corner, things from the office I hadn't sorted yet. A heavy one full of old invoices toppled over, spilling its contents across the floor. Just perfect, I whispered, my voice thick. I knelt to clean up the mess of scattered receipts and ancient tax forms, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a ledger or a file. It was a small black leather-bound notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore. It must have been tucked between the ledgers. It was a diary, her diary. With trembling fingers I opened it. Her elegant script filled the page. I flipped past entries about biscuit recipes and rude customers until a date from 5 years ago caught my eye. Entry 1. David and Meredith were here. Asked for a $20,000 loan. I know it's for Amber's new car. They're bleeding her dry with their demands. I said no. David was cruel. He threatened to have me evaluated, threatened to put me in a home if I didn't cooperate. I've never been so frightened. My breath hitched. I flipped forward. 2 years ago. Entry 2. Amber and Chad visited. They left this morning. My wedding ring is gone. The one from their grandfather. It was on my nightstand. I've looked everywhere. I know Amber took it. I can't prove it. I feel so alone. Who steals from their own grandmother? I turned the last few pages, my tears blurring the ink. The last entry was from 6 months ago. Entry 3. My new will is done. Mr. Harrison has the only copy. It's all for Reese. It's the only way to protect her. They will come for it. They will say I am crazy. They will try to break her. Let them. The truth is in this book. She is stronger than they know. I stopped crying. The sobs just ceased. My eyes were dry. The grief, the fear, the self-pity, it all burned away in an instant, replaced by something else. Something cold and hard and clean. My hand was steady as I picked up my phone. I pressed the number of the only person in this town who had looked at me with malice. I didn't even wait for him to say hello. Elias, it's Reese. I need your help. I have a plan, and I need you to install some cameras. The plan started with a lie. I found Mrs. Gable at the post office the next morning buying stamps. I'd made sure I looked the part, shadows under my eyes, my hair uncombed, my shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't hard to fake exhaustion. I accidentally bumped into her dropping a letter. "Oh, Reese," she said, her usual disapproval softened by a flicker of pity. "You look unwell, dear." I bit my lip, letting my voice tremble. "Mrs. Gable," I whispered, pulling her just out of earshot of the clerk. I can't do it." Her eyes, sharp and bird-like, lit up with the thrill of fresh gossip. "Can't do what, child?" They were right. I choked out, letting a single hot tear slip. "My family, the town, it's just too much. I'm selling. I'm selling it all." Her breath hitched. "Selling to who? A corporate buyer, a restaurant group from Denver," I whispered as if it were a dirty secret. "They're coming on Friday at 3 to finalize the offer. I'm going to walk away. Please, please don't tell anyone. I can't bear it." I knew that rumor would hit my mother's phone before I even got back to the bakery. Elias was a ghost. He arrived after midnight on Thursday and installed the cameras while I pretended to box up inventory. They were tiny black-lensed eyes, smaller than a dime. One went into a dead power outlet in the bakery's back office, aimed at the desk and the safe. The other he masterfully tucked into the spine of a thick, unread copy of Moby Dick on the living room shelf. It had a perfect view of the front door and my grandmother's desk. Sheriff Brody had been receptive. The moment I'd slid that black diary across his desk, his entire demeanor had shifted. The family dispute had evaporated, replaced by the grim, focused look of a man seeing elder abuse and conspiracy. He agreed to the plan. "It's entrapment if we make them do it, Reese," he'd said, handing the diary back to me. "But if we just create an opportunity for them to be who they truly are, that's just good police work." On Friday morning, I made a show of it. I loaded 2 large suitcases, mostly filled with old towels and books, into my sedan. I drove to the bus station 2 towns over, parked my car conspicuously in the long-term lot, and bought a one-way ticket to Denver I never planned to use. At 10:04 a.m., Elias's old truck pulled up behind the station. I slouched down in the passenger seat, my heart a cold stone in my chest, and he drove us back, parking in a quiet, overgrown alley a block away from Willow Way. We didn't have to wait long. Sheriff Brody pulled up behind us at 10:30 a.m. in an unmarked cruiser. He climbed into the back, setting a laptop on the center console. He split the screen between the 2 live feeds. The house was silent. The bakery was dark. We waited. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. My stomach was eating itself, the coffee I'd chugged turning to acid. "Maybe they're not coming," I whispered. "Maybe the rumor wasn't enough." Brody just sipped his lukewarm coffee. "Greed is always punctual, Reese. They'll come." At 3:05 p.m., a white rental car, the exact same one my parents had driven before, turned onto Willow Way. It parked right in my driveway, angled aggressively. My heart didn't just hammer, it seized. The doors opened. My mother Meredith got out carrying her large purse. Amber got out looking frantic. And Chad followed, looking as bored as ever. "Bingo," Brody muttered. I watched, my breath frozen in my lungs, as my mother walked right up to my front door, dug in her purse, and pulled out a key. A key I'd never given her. A key she'd clearly had, made weeks, maybe months ago. The lock clicked. They were in. The feed from the living room camera crackled to life. The audio was perfect. My mother was in charge. "Good," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "She's finally gone. David's lawyer said we must find the real ledgers. We have to prove June was incompetent and that Reese is hiding the profits." Amber, true to form, was already tearing the cushions off the sofa. "She has to have another will. June promised me this house when I was 18. Find it. Find it." Chad, meanwhile, pulled out his phone. He looked at the wall, then sighed. "Yeah, I'm at the house now. Know the bakery. The locksmith will be here in 10. He'll get us into the office. Reese was stupid. Looks like she only rekeyed the front door, not the back." My head snapped toward Brody. He just raised an eyebrow. The audio crackled again. It was my mother now, at Grandma's roll-top desk, yanking open the drawers. "While we wait for the locksmith," she spat, her voice laced with venom, "let's find that stupid diary June was always writing in. If we find it, we burn it. It's the only thing that can really hurt us." Sheriff Brody didn't even look at me. He just picked up his radio. "That's breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and intent to destroy evidence. All units move in." It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing I had ever seen. 2 squad cars, lights silent, peeled out from the side street, boxing the rental car into the driveway. I saw Amber's face appear in the front window, her mouth forming a perfect O of slack-jawed shock. Brody and I got out of the cruiser. Elias stayed put. I walked my legs, feeling like they were moving through wet cement, as Brody went up the porch steps, his hand on his hip. We heard shouting, muffled screams. A minute later, the front door was yanked open. A deputy led Chad out first, his hands cuffed behind him, his face a mask of dull surprise. Then Amber, who was full on, shrieking, sobbing. "You don't understand. It's our house. It's ours." And then, my mother. She was led out in handcuffs, her face pale, her expensive blouse rumpled. She wasn't crying, she wasn't yelling, she was radiating a cold, dark fury. When she saw me standing there on the sidewalk, her expression didn't change to shame. It wasn't remorse. She stopped walking, forcing the deputy to tug on her arm. She stared right at me, and her voice was a venomous whisper that cut right through the chaos. "You!" she hissed. "You did this! You called them! You will never be one of us again!" I sat on a hard plastic chair under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the Silver Creek Sheriff's Station. It smelled like stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and the faintest hint of desperation. This was our new family meeting spot. My mother Meredith and my sister Amber were in a small, windowless interrogation room down the hall. Chad was in another. I was in the waiting area watching the clock tick, feeling strangely calm. The front door of the station opened and my father David stumbled in. He looked like he'd been pulled from a wreckage. His expensive suit was crumpled, his face was a pale ashen gray, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd screamed at him in my house. He wasn't here to threaten, he wasn't here to command, he was here to beg. He saw me, and his eyes, God, his eyes, he couldn't even look at me. "Reese," he started, his voice a dry, rasping croak. "He wants to see the evidence," Sheriff Brody said, appearing at my side. He cut my father off before he could say another word. Brody led him into his small, cluttered office. He didn't close the door all the way. I heard the click of the laptop's spacebar, and then I heard the audio feed from my living room clear as day. My mother's voice. "Find that stupid diary June was always writing in. If we find it, we burn it. It's the only thing that can really hurt us." I watched my father's silhouette through the frosted glass. He leaned over, bracing himself on Brody's desk, as if he were going to be sick. Then Brody handed him the diary. My father sat down hard, his face in his hands. He knew. They were trapped. An hour later, we were all convened in a sterile conference room. My mother, father, and Amber sat on one side of the laminate table. Their new, slick-looking lawyer, Mr. Vance, sat at the head. I sat on the other side alone. Sheriff Brody stood by the door. "All right," Vance said, clapping his hands together with a false brightness. "This is clearly a significant family misunderstanding, a terrible lapse in judgment fueled by grief on all sides." He aimed a saccharine smile at me. "My clients are of course willing to drop the contestation of the will immediately. In exchange, Reese, you will agree to drop all these unfortunate criminal charges." This was it. The neat and tidy escape hatch they always looked for. The deal. They would trade the will they could no longer win for the criminal charges they could not beat. I looked at them one by one. Amber, her face puffy and red, staring at her own hands. She wasn't crying from remorse. She was crying because she'd lost. My father, who looked hollowed out, a ghost in a good suit. And my mother, who stared at a spot on the wall just past my head, her face a mask of cold, empty pride. "No," I said. The lawyer blinked. I beg your pardon?" I said, "No, I'm not dropping the charges." I leaned forward, my voice quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "You don't get it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. You tried to destroy me. You slandered my name in this town. You vandalized my property. You tried to ruin my grandmother's reputation. You broke into my home. You tried to erase the one person who ever loved me." "Now, Ms. Victoria," the lawyer started, "let's not be hysterical." "I'm not done," I said, my gaze locked on my father. "But I will offer you a deal. My deal." I slid 2 documents across the table. Brody had already procured a notary who was waiting in the hall. "What is this?" Vance asked, snatching the papers. "The first," I said, "is a legally binding, fully notarized document permanently relinquishing all claims to June's will and estate from all of you. The second is a restraining order. It bars David, Meredith, Amber, and Chad from contacting me, my business, or stepping foot within the town limits of Silver Creek ever again." "This is absurd!" Amber shrieked, finding her voice. "You can't. You sign those," I said, my voice like ice, "right here, right now. You sign them, And I will speak to the district attorney. I will not drop the charges. You will all have a criminal record, but I will ask him to recommend probation and community service over jail time." The silence in the room was absolute. Vance whispered furiously in my father's ear. My father just looked at my mother, whose cold mask finally cracked. Her expression was pure hatred, but he shook his head. "Get the notary, Sheriff." My father said, his voice dead. They signed, one by one. My father's hand was steady. My mother's was a rigid claw. Amber wept thick, ugly sobs as she signed away the house she was promised. Chad just signed his name like he was signing a credit card receipt. They were processed and released pending the DA's review. I stood on the steps of the station watching them pile into their rental car. David wouldn't look at me. Meredith's glare felt like it could light me on fire. Amber was still crying. As the car pulled away, I expected to feel triumphant, vengeful, happy. I felt nothing. The white-hot rage that had been a steel rod in my spine for weeks just dissolved. The profound, aching grief that had been my shadow, it was gone. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt light. The massive, crushing weight I had been carrying my entire life, the weight of their expectations, their disappointments, their endless, bottomless need was finally completely lifted. I was just Reese. I stood on the steps, breathing in the cold night air. It felt different, cleaner. A truck pulled up to the curb. Elias. He didn't get out, just leaned over the passenger seat looking at me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Heard you need a new mixer." I actually laughed. It was a real, rusty, aching laugh that came from my gut. It was the first real laugh in months. 1 year later, the Colorado sun streamed through a window that was spotless. The air inside didn't smell like spoiled milk or sabotage. It smelled like cardamom, dark roast coffee, and browning butter. The bell over the door tinkled, a sound I had come to love. The bakery was no longer the Silver Sparrow. A new, beautifully painted sign hung out front, carved by Elias himself, "The Sparrow and the Thorn." It was packed. Every table was full. Mrs. Gable was in her usual corner booth holding court with 2 other women, her church concerns long forgotten. She was now our most loyal customer, claiming our scones were the only ones in the state worth the calories. I wiped a streak of flour off my face, leaving a new one in its place. "No, I'm telling you," I argued, laughing. "If we add the orange zest before the chocolate it seizes, it has to go in at the end." Elias, standing beside me, dusted flour from his own apron. He was no longer just the town handyman. He was my partner in every sense of the word. He'd discovered a shocking hidden talent for artisanal bread. "It's a chemical reaction, Reese. That's not how emulsions work," he countered, but his eyes were crinkling at the corners. He leaned in and kissed the floury tip of my nose. "But you're the boss. We'll do it your way." The bakery was thriving. My journey, the arrests, the scandal, the black and white proof in that diary had become a local legend. I'd thought I would be the town pariah forever, but in fighting back and refusing to be a victim, I had somehow tapped into that deep American value of resilience, of standing your ground. I had earned their respect. I was no longer poor June's granddaughter. I was Reese, the woman who'd saved the town bakery. As for my family, the restraining order had done its work. The town of Silver Creek, once my family's weapon, had turned against them with a quiet, unified judgment. The gossip that had almost destroyed me turned its focus on them. My parents and Amber had sold their homes in Denver, or as I'd heard, were forced to sell to cover the legal fees and the restitution I'd demanded for the bakery. They moved somewhere out of state. Arizona, maybe. I didn't know. I didn't care. They were just gone. The disgrace was total. I got one letter. It arrived last week on the 1-year anniversary of the arrest. The postmark was from Phoenix. The return address was just a name: David, my father. I held it for a long time, right there in the middle of the busy bakery. I felt Elias's eyes on me. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. It was just a piece of paper. I thought about opening it. I wondered if it was an apology, a final threat, or just a desperate plea. I realized it didn't matter. There was nothing he could say that would change anything. It wasn't an apology I needed anyway. It was just over. I walked to the back to the massive, beautiful new brick oven Elias and I had built together. I opened the heavy iron door, and the wave of heat hit my face. I didn't even read the first line. I just tossed the envelope in, and in a single brilliant flash of orange, my father's last words turned to ash. That evening, I sat on the porch of my house. The dusty blue paint was gone, replaced with a warm, creamy white. The vines had been tamed, and the porch swing Elias had fixed for my grandmother was newly stained. I was sipping a beer, watching the sun bleed purple and gold behind the mountains. The air was cool and clean. Elias came out sitting beside me, putting his arm around my shoulder. He was quiet, comfortable in the silence. We just sat listening to the crickets, watching the day end. There was no fear of a key in the lock, no dread of a phone call, no weight of expectation. The house was no longer a prize or a fortress. It was just home. My grandmother left me a house, but my family, they gave me a war. And in winning it, I didn't just win a bakery. I won myself. And I learned that the only family that matters is the one you build. The one that when the time comes helps you change the locks. With the bakery thriving and her past finally behind her, Reese had found her peace. What did you think of her incredible journey from betrayal to triumph? Let us know in the comments. We read every single thought you share. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.